The snow had been falling for hours, coating the ground in a thick white silence. Thomas pulled his threadbare coat tighter around his shoulders as the wind bit at his face. Grace walked beside him, her scarf pulled up to her nose, and little Leo trudged between them, holding his father's hand with mittened fingers. The boy's steps were slow, his boots soaked through. They had been walking since dawn, leaving behind the empty camp near the highway where they had spent the last few nights. The food was gone, and the firewood had run out. There was no reason to stay. Thomas hoped to find a town ahead, some place where a man could get work for a day or two, maybe enough to buy a proper meal for his family. By mid-afternoon, the sky had turned the color of steel. Snow whirled around them in small, twisting flurries. When they reached the frozen river, Thomas stopped. The bridge ahead was old, its boards slick with ice. "Stay close," he said, gripping Leo's hand a little tighter. They crossed carefully, boots creaking on the frozen wood. Halfway across, something glinted near the railing, a dull shimmer beneath a thin sheet of snow. Thomas paused, crouched, and brushed the snow away. It was a key, old brass, heavy and ornate. The teeth were worn smooth with age, but the bow was shaped like a leaf, finely detailed and still beautiful despite the cold. "What is it, Papa?" Leo asked, peering down. "A key," Thomas murmured. "Someone must have dropped it." Grace leaned closer. "Strange place to lose a key out here." Thomas slipped it into his pocket. "Maybe it opened something nearby," he said. Though he doubted there was much of anything to open in this frozen wilderness, they continued across the bridge and followed the road that wound uphill through pines bent under the weight of snow. The wind whistled through the branches, and Leo began to cry quietly from the cold. "Just a little farther," Grace said, though her own voice trembled. By dusk, the storm grew worse. Thomas scanned the darkening woods for any sign of shelter. Then, through the swirling snow, he saw a faint shape ahead, a low roof, a chimney, and a window glowing faintly with amber light. "Grace, look, it was a cottage, small but solid-looking, tucked between two tall evergreens." Smoke rose from the chimney. Someone was there. Thomas's heart leapt and then sank again. "We can't just walk in," he said. "It's private property." But Grace was already moving forward. "We can ask for help. Just a little warmth for the boy." They reached the door. Light flickered through the window, firelight steady and calm. Thomas knocked once, then again. No answer. He hesitated, then tried the latch. It was locked. He sighed and turned to leave, when his hand brushed against the key in his pocket. He stared at it, then at the door. The shape of the lock. It looked about the right size. He hesitated only a moment before sliding the key in. It turned smoothly, as if it had been waiting for him. The door creaked open. Warm air, rich with the smell of wood smoke and bread, drifted out. "Hello?" Thomas called. No reply. Inside, the room was cozy and neat. A fire burned in the hearth. A loaf of bread sat cooling on the table beside a pot of stew. There were 2 chairs, a bed made up with quilts, and a shelf of simple dishes. Grace stepped in slowly, eyes wide. "Is anyone here?" Silence. Leo ran to the fire and held out his hands. "It's warm, Mama." Thomas closed the door behind them and called out once more. Still nothing. The only sound was the crackle of firewood. He turned to Grace. "Maybe they've gone to town. Or maybe they left it for someone," she said quietly. Her eyes on the stew. On the mantel above the hearth was a note, written in neat, faded script. "To the traveler, if you have come here cold and hungry, be welcome. This place is meant for you. Eat what you need. Rest as long as you must. When you are able, leave it ready for the next soul." J.T. Grace read it aloud, her voice trembling. Thomas felt something in his chest shift, a mixture of disbelief and relief, so strong it nearly unsteadied him. They ate in silence, grateful beyond words. The stew was thick and hot, the bread soft and fresh. Afterward, Leo fell asleep on the rug by the fire. Grace knelt beside him and brushed the hair from his forehead. "Whoever J.T. was," she whispered, "they saved us tonight." Thomas nodded, looking at the key resting on the table. "Maybe," he said softly, "it was meant to find us." When Thomas woke, grey light filtered through the small window. The fire had burned low, a deep red heart of coals under a layer of ash. He sat up slowly, the stiffness of days on the road easing from his joints. For the first time in weeks, he had slept without fear of the cold creeping in. Grace was already awake, sitting at the table with a mug of tea. Leo still slept beneath a quilt on the floor, one arm thrown across his face. "Morning," Thomas said softly. Grace looked up and smiled. "There's a pump out back. The water isn't frozen," Thomas nodded. "That's something." He pulled on his coat and stepped outside. The air was sharp but still. Snow hung heavy on the branches, muffling every sound. Behind the cottage stood a small shed, and beyond that, the line of the frozen river glinting pale under the early sun. He found the pump and worked the handle until clear water gushed into the bucket. It was the cleanest water he'd seen in months. Inside, Grace had found oats and dried fruit in a tin. She stirred them into a pot of boiling water, humming quietly. The smell filled the room. When Leo woke, he sat blinking at the steam, smiling sleepily. "This place," Grace said, glancing around the room. "It feels tended, like someone still cares for it," Thomas nodded. On the mantel beneath JT's note sat a small wooden box. Inside were a few coins, a sewing kit, 2 candles, and a folded piece of paper. He unfolded it carefully. "To whomever keeps this place next. The seasons turn and travelers change, but the rule remains: leave it better than you found it. If you take food, replace it when you can. If you burn wood, cut more before you go. Keep the key with you until you return it to the hook." JT Grace read over his shoulder. "So it is meant to be shared. Seems that way." Thomas replaced the note. "We'll stay until the storm clears. Then we'll see." They spent the day exploring the small property. Behind the cottage was a narrow shed full of neatly stacked firewood and a rusted axe. The garden beyond lay buried in snow, but rows of stakes marked where vegetables might grow in warmer months. Inside the shed hung tools: an old spade, a saw, a fishing pole with line still wound tight. Whoever JT was, they had built this place to last. That afternoon, Thomas found a trapdoor in the floor beneath the rug. It opened to a short cellar filled with jars, preserves, pickled vegetables, even a few tins of meat. He laughed aloud. "Grace, come see." "It's a treasure trove." She climbed down after him, her lantern lighting rows of shelves. "It's like someone thought of everything." They brought up enough supplies for several days. After supper, they sat by the fire, full and warm. The storm outside rattled softly against the windows, but inside the world was calm. Leo traced shapes in the fogged glass. "Do you think JT will come back, Papa?" Thomas thought for a moment. "Maybe someday. But until then, it's our turn to look after it." Grace reached for his hand. "We could fix the fence come spring. Maybe plant something." He looked at her. The tiredness in her face softened by the firelight, and felt hope stirring, fragile but real. "Yes," he said. "We could." Before bed, he hung the brass key on a nail beside the door, where it caught the glow of the fire. It looked at home there, gleaming faintly like a promise. That night, Thomas dreamed of a man he didn't know, broad-shouldered, kind-eyed, building the cottage log by log, humming as snow fell around him. In the dream, the man set the key upon the table, smiled, and walked away into the white woods. The storm lasted 3 more days. Each morning Thomas cleared the snow from the doorstep, and each night Grace lit a candle in the window. They kept the fire fed, cooked sparingly, and read the few old books that lined the small shelf by the hearth. When the weather finally broke, the world outside glistened in white stillness. A thin layer of mist hung above the trees, and the air smelled of pine and smoke. Thomas stood on the porch with a mug of tea and felt for the first time in a long while that the cold might end. "We should see what's down the road," he said. Grace nodded. "If there's a town nearby, we can trade for flour or salt." They left Leo at the cottage and followed the road for an hour, passing frozen fields and an old stone wall half buried in snow. Eventually they reached a signpost at a crossroads. One arrow pointed toward a village called Ridgeway, 3 miles ahead. By noon, they reached it, a cluster of houses around a small church and a general store. Smoke rose from chimneys. The air carried the smell of baking bread. It felt alive in a way the cities no longer did. Thomas approached the store first. The man behind the counter looked up as the bell jingled. "Morning," Thomas said. "Name's Thomas. My family and I are staying a bit up the road, by the river." The shopkeeper wiped his hands on his apron. "You mean the Walker place?" Thomas frowned. "Maybe. Little cottage by the ridge?" "That's the one. Folks used to call it Walker's Rest. Belonged to a man named John Turner Walker. J.T. He built it himself years ago. Used to let travelers stay over winters." "Good man," Grace's eyes widened. "So he really existed?" "Oh, yes," the shopkeeper said. "Haven't seen him in years, though. Some say he went west. But the cottage is still there, kept up somehow. Guess his kindness has a way of keeping itself." Thomas smiled. "Seems that way." He bought a small sack of flour and a tin of tea with the few coins left in the wooden box, promising to repay the rest in work come spring. Over the next weeks, they made the place their own. Thomas mended the roof, patched the shutters, and cleared the snow from the garden. Grace washed every quilt and curtain, singing softly as she worked. Leo helped gather wood and sometimes sat by the river, dropping pebbles through holes in the ice and watching the ripples. When the thaw came, they found green shoots pushing through the soil. Grace knelt beside them, smiling. "See that, Leo? Life comes back. They planted what seeds they found in an old tin. Beans, carrots, onions." Thomas made a new fence from fallen branches. The cottage, once silent and empty, filled with the sounds of living again. Hammer on wood, water in buckets, laughter around the fire. Occasionally travelers passed, a man on a horse, a wagon carrying lumber, a woman with a sack of letters bound for the next town. Each time Thomas offered water, a warm meal, or simply directions. The habit of generosity spread as naturally as breathing. One evening, a young couple appeared at dusk, their cart broken on the road. Grace welcomed them in without question. They stayed the night, eating stew and sleeping by the fire. When they left the next morning, Thomas handed them a small jar of preserves and said, "Leave what you can for the next ones." Grace smiled as they watched the cart roll away. "You're becoming J.T. yourself," Thomas laughed. Maybe that's the point. Spring deepened. Birds returned to the trees, the river melted free, and Leo grew brown from the sun. The cottage no longer felt borrowed. It felt earned. One afternoon, while clearing the attic, Thomas found an old ledger bound in leather. The first page was marked the Walker's Ledger. Inside, dozens of names filled the columns. Travelers, families, wanderers, each with a short note in J.T.'s careful hand: "Left the kettle mended. Fixed the gate before leaving. Took flour, left apples. Sang by the fire, fine voice." The last entry was years old. "Snow heavy this year. Leaving soon. Hope someone else keeps the fire." Thomas closed the book and held it for a long time. When he showed it to Grace, she pressed her fingers to the page. "Then we're the next line," she said. That night she wrote in neat letters. "Thomas, Grace, and Leo found the key on the river bridge. Restored the garden. We'll keep the fire." And below it she added, "The door is open." Summer came slowly that year, creeping up through the thawing earth. The river ran fast and clear again, its banks alive with the hum of insects and the green of new shoots. The cottage, once a refuge of necessity, had become a home. Thomas rose with the dawn each morning to cut wood and tend the small patch of vegetables. Grace baked bread in the iron stove and kept a pot of herbs drying by the window. Leo spent hours by the river, building small dams and catching minnows in his hands. Sometimes travelers still came, a pair of fishermen looking for a dry night, a woman and her daughter carrying bundles of cloth to sell in Ridgeway, a peddler with a cart full of odd trinkets and buttons. All were welcomed the same way: food, warmth, and a roof until they could move on. Each one left something behind: a loaf, a blanket, a few coins, a story. Grace wrote every name carefully in the ledger, her handwriting small but neat. She had started a second page for those who didn't leave their names. The silent ones? She called them, but she still noted their gifts: a bag of apples, a mended handle, fresh nails for the porch. By midsummer, the garden was in full bloom. Beans climbed their stakes, and the carrots pushed up dark green tops. Grace laughed one afternoon when Leo ran inside, carrying a basket overflowing with the first harvest. "Look, Mama, we grew this." They feasted that night on roasted vegetables and warm bread. Thomas poured a cup of cider from the cellar, raising it with a grin. "To JT, whoever he was, and to the next traveler who finds this place." Grace lifted her cup too, "and to us, for keeping it alive." As the sun set beyond the ridge, the light poured through the windows like honey, and the cottage glowed, a warm heart in the forest. Later that summer, Thomas met the man who owned the general store again. His name was Cal Everett, a kind-eyed fellow with a grey beard. Thomas had walked into town to trade vegetables for salt and oil. "So you're still up at the Walker place," Cal said, weighing the beans. "That old key found the right hands," Thomas smiled. "Feels like it did. You know," Cal went on, "there's a story folks tell, that JT left that key out on purpose on the bridge, so whoever was meant to keep the place would find it. Some think he never really left, just passed it along." Thomas chuckled softly. "Then I guess I'm the next caretaker," Cal nodded. "Reckon you are." When Thomas returned home, he found Grace sitting on the porch mending a shirt. Leo was chasing dragonflies through the tall grass. For the first time in years, Thomas felt entirely still, not running, not searching, simply there. That night, as the family sat watching fireflies rise from the fields, Grace said, "We could stay here a long time." "Maybe forever," Thomas answered. "But the rule stays the same. Leave it ready for the next soul," she smiled. "I think JT would approve." By late summer, word of the cottage had spread. Travelers began leaving notes on the door when they passed, short blessings, bits of gratitude, sketches of the view from the hill. Grace kept them all in a small tin by the hearth. One note, written in delicate handwriting, read, "Found warmth when I had none. Whoever you are, may the road rise kindly to meet you." Another simply said, "The stew was good, the company better." Sometimes Thomas would sit by the fire at night and read them aloud, smiling. Leo had taken to carving small wooden keys, one after another, leaving them on the mantel beside the brass one. "So no one forgets," he said when Grace asked why. As the days grew shorter, the first leaves began to turn gold. The air smelled of apples and smoke again. The season had come full circle, yet everything was changed. Grace stood by the river one evening, watching the water slide smooth and steady over the rocks. The sun lit her hair like copper. "It's funny," she said when Thomas joined her. "We came here running from the world and somehow found our way back to it." Thomas took her hand. "Maybe that's what kindness does. It brings you home." Autumn slipped in quietly. The mornings came colder. The river steamed where it met the air, and the hills around the cottage burned with color, copper, gold, and rust. Thomas gathered wood every day, stacking it neatly against the shed wall. Grace filled jars with preserves and herbs, lining them in rows that gleamed like jewels in the lantern light. Leo helped pack dried beans into sacks and brush dust from the windows. He was taller now, his laughter surer. The long, hungry days of wandering felt like a story from another life. One evening a knock came at the door. When Thomas opened it, he found a man standing there with a blanket over his shoulders and a horse tethered behind him. "Evening," the stranger said. "Name's Finch. The weather turned on me quicker than I thought." Thomas stepped aside. "Come in. There's stew on the stove." Finch entered gratefully, stamping the snow from his boots. Grace handed him a bowl and a cup of tea. As he ate, his eyes wandered around the cozy room. "Didn't expect a place like this out here," he said. "It's a lucky find," Thomas replied. "Belonged to a man named Walker once. We just keep it going." Finch nodded slowly. "Walker's Rest," he murmured. "I've heard the name. My father passed through here years ago. Said a stranger gave him shelter one winter." Grace smiled. "Then it's come full circle. The man stayed the night, sleeping soundly near the fire. When he left at dawn, he pressed a small pouch into Thomas's hand. 'Dried tobacco,' he said, 'for whoever comes next.'" Thomas thanked him, hanging the pouch on the hook beside the key. As the season deepened, more visitors came. A woodcutter caught in the rain, a mother and her 2 children seeking a place to rest. An old woman who claimed she'd once known JT herself. Each left something behind, a loaf, a story, a prayer. Grace's ledger filled quickly. She added another book, calling it The Second Season. One crisp morning, as Thomas chopped wood, a wagon appeared on the road, the young couple who had broken down the previous spring. They carried a basket of apples and a bundle of fabric. "We've done well this year," the woman said, smiling. "Thought we'd bring something back." Grace welcomed them with open arms. They stayed for supper, laughing around the fire as the wind rattled outside. When they left, the woman paused at the door. "You were the first to help us," she said. "We've been doing the same ever since." Thomas watched them go, the snow just beginning to fall again. Winter arrived gently but steadily. The first frost clung to the windows like lace. Thomas built a heavier door for the shed and patched the roof once more. Grace stocked the cellar until it was full. On the first real snow, Leo came running inside, cheeks red, holding something small in his mitten. "Look," he cried. "Another key!" Thomas took it, brushing off the snow. It was a plain iron key this time, cold and unremarkable, yet familiar somehow. He turned it in his hand, thoughtful. "Where'd you find it?" "Down by the river," Leo said. "Right near the bridge." Grace's eyes met Thomas's over the boy's head. She smiled softly. "Maybe it's the river's way of saying thank you." They hung the iron key beside the brass one on the wall. Two symbols now, one old, one new, glinting side by side. That night Thomas sat at the table and wrote in the ledger again. "A year has passed since we found the first key. The house stands warm. The garden rests. Others have come and gone, each leaving something kind behind. The rule holds true. Leave it better than you found it." He closed the book and set his pen down. The fire crackled. Grace hummed softly as she mended a blanket, and Leo built towers of woodblocks by the hearth. Outside, the snow fell thicker, hiding the road, covering the footprints that led to the door. Inside, the world glowed with light and quiet gratitude. Thomas looked at his family, then at the keys on the wall. "When the time comes," he said softly, "we'll know when to leave it for the next ones." Grace nodded. "And they'll know how to care for it, just like we did." Years passed softly, as they often do in places where time moves by the rhythm of the seasons. The boy grew tall. His voice deepened. Thomas's hair silvered, and Grace's hands grew slower but never idle. The cottage aged with them. The floorboards creaked a little more. The shutters needed mending each spring, and the stones of the hearth darkened with soot and memory. Yet it remained the same at its heart, warm, welcoming, alive. Visitors still came, sometimes strangers, sometimes the same faces returning with their children. The ledgers multiplied, 4 of them now, filled edge to edge with names, dates, and tokens of gratitude. Grace began keeping the earliest one wrapped in cloth, the ink fading but the words still legible. "Found warmth when I had none." The stew was good, the company better. "May this home never be empty." Leo often sat by the fire, reading the old entries aloud, his voice steady and thoughtful. "They all sound the same, don't they?" he said one night. "Different people, same feeling," Thomas smiled. "That's the point, son. The house teaches us all the same lesson." One spring morning, Thomas walked to the bridge, where he had first found the brass key so many years before. The river ran high with meltwater, gleaming like a ribbon of glass. He stood there for a long while, listening to the rush and murmur of it. When he returned, he told Grace quietly, "It's time." She nodded. "I know." They packed lightly, a few clothes, Grace's sewing kit, Leo's books. The rest they left where it belonged. Grace cleaned the kitchen until it shone. Thomas stacked fresh wood by the hearth and left a loaf of bread on the table. Leo hung the brass key on its nail by the door, beside the iron one. Then he placed a third, a small wooden key he had carved himself, between them. "For luck," he said. Grace took up the ledger and wrote the last entry in careful script. "The house stands ready for whoever needs it next. May kindness find you here as it found us." Then she closed the book and set it on the table beside the loaf. The family left early the next morning. Mist hung low in the fields. Thomas turned once on the path to look back, the chimney still smoking faintly, the curtains moving with the draught. He smiled, touched Grace's shoulder, and they walked on. For a time the cottage slept, quiet under the trees. Then, as it always did, life found its way back. A traveller crossing the bridge noticed the glint of brass in the doorway. He paused, lifted the key, and felt the familiar weight of promise in his palm. The door opened easily, as if it had been waiting for him. Inside, the firewood was stacked, the bread still soft, and the ledger opened to a fresh page. He smiled and picked up the pen. "Found warmth when I had none," he wrote, and so it began again.